Continuing with the analysis, we will now discuss the definitive scientific test of the radical hypothesis we've been exploring.
That's right.
We have spent a good amount of time laying the groundwork, establishing how ancient traditions, myths, texts, they all seem to point north.
To a single lost origin point far in the north. But you're right, that only gets us so far.
Exactly. It's compelling, but it's not proof. So now we are moving entirely out of the realm of ancient literature and legend.
And straight into the laboratory. We're talking about cosmology, geology, and biology.
This is the real pivot point for the entire argument, isn't it?
It has to be. I mean, it's one thing to say ancient people believed this. It's entirely another to claim that modern impartial science, working totally independently, confirms this exact geographical belief.
And the claim is, it's a bold one, that the cradle of the human race, this Eden, was situated precisely at the North Pole.
In a country that was then submerged by the Great Deluge. That's the idea now being subjected to the hard, verifiable evidence of the physical sciences.
It's the ultimate litmus test. The author's goal here is, frankly, incredibly ambitious.
Oh, massively so.
To demonstrate that independent scientific findings don't just, allow for this polar hypothesis, but that they actively confirm it. It's an exercise in consilience.
That's the perfect word for it, where different, totally unrelated fields of study all converge on the same, really counterintuitive point.
And they have to converge because this whole idea just flies in the face of conventional wisdom.
It does. Both historically, which always placed Eden in warm places like Mesopotamia,
right,
and geographically, given our modern perception of the Arctic, we see it as this ice-locked wasteland.
So to overcome that inertia, the author presents what he calls this convergence of evidence, synthesis of multiple data streams.
Exactly.
So what are they? What are these essential scientific streams that have to align perfectly to make this work?
Okay. There are 6 major fields that need to cooperate, which, when you put them all together, they create a 7th point of confirmation. First, you have scientific cosmology, which dictates where life must have started. Then astronomical geography, which is all about that unique polar day and night cycle.
Right.
Then physiographical geology, which has to account for how a whole continent could disappear.
The cataclysm.
The cataclysm. Then you've got prehistoric climatology, confirming the climate was temperate. And finally, paleontological botany and paleontological zoology.
So plants and animals.
Plants and animals. The whole hypothesis, according to the source material, stands or falls on whether all of these distinct disciplines point to that single circumpolar location.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start with the biggest scale imaginable, the astronomical confirmation.
Right.
This is the argument that the very physics of a cooling Earth just naturally selected the pole as the first spot suitable for life, what the text calls Eden life.
This is a classic 19th century argument, and it's rooted in the thermodynamics of planetary formation. You have to imagine the Earth right after it formed.
A giant, hot, molten ball of rock.
Exactly. A massive, volatile, incandescent sphere. As it starts that long, long process of secular cooling, you have to ask a simple question. Where does it cool the fastest?
Well, if you think about it like a sphere radiating heat into space, the heat should escape most efficiently from the parts with the most exposure to space.
Which would be?
The extremities. The poles.
Precisely. The rotational geometry means the poles dissipate heat more rapidly than the equatorial bulge, which gets more direct solar energy. And, well, internal heat is sort of trapped by the physics of rotation.
So the logic is that the first parts of the Earth's surface to cool down enough, not just to form rock, but to support complex life,
were assuredly at the poles. That's the direct quote.
That just flips our entire modern assumption on its head. We assume life starts where it's warm.
But the source material argues life began where it first became cool enough to support complex carbon-based structures. The poles were the first sanctuary, simply because they were the first parts of the planet to cross that critical temperature threshold.
It's a compelling piece of logic for the time. It suggests that if you're a scientist looking for the earliest possible geographical point for complex life, physics guides you directly to the circumpolar region.
It has to.
Okay, so that handles the temperature requirement, but that immediately brings up the second and maybe the most counterintuitive problem.
The problem of light.
The problem of light. We all know that at the geographic North Pole, you have roughly 6 months of daylight followed by 6 months of unbroken darkness.
Right.
How can 6 months of night possibly be conducive to an Eden-like life?
And the source material tackles this head-on. It argues that the pole is actually the most favored on the globe, specifically because of the glories of the night and the constant daylight.
It turns a disadvantage into an advantage.
A singular, undeniable advantage, especially for the development of an intelligent, technologically nascent race like the first humans.
Okay, so let's break down the mechanics of this. The annual light cycle in this theoretical polar Eden, what does that look like?
Well, during the 6 months of continuous daylight, the sun doesn't rise and set like it does for us.
No daily cycle.
No daily cycle at all. Instead, it just circles around and around the world's great axis in full view. It sort of hovers near the horizon, spiraling upwards for 3 months to its highest point at the summer solstice,
And then back down again.
and then spirals downward for 3 months until it touches the horizon again at the autumnal equinox. The key is that no night falls on this favored homeland at the pole during that entire time.
So you have this continuous, gentle solar warmth and light, which, if you pair it with that temperate climate we're going to talk about later.
Is exactly what you'd need to support that description of unimagined vigor and luxuriance of life.
Okay, but let's face the darkness. 6 months of night. That is a profound environmental pressure.
It is, and this is where the astronomical argument gets really interesting, because the night isn't presented as a challenge. It's presented as a magnificent, unique asset. For one, the inhabitants would have 2 months of continuous moonlight. The moon, just like the sun, would circle the horizon without setting. But the most critical part is that this long period of darkness creates a magnificent natural observatory.
A natural observatory. I like that phrase. But why is the pole better than, say, the equator for watching the stars?
It's all about the geometry. If you're standing at the equator, the sky appears to rotate straight over your head. Stars rise and set perpendicular to the horizon. You only ever see half the sky, and everything is in constant rapid motion.
Okay.
But at the pole, the axis of the Earth is lined up vertically with your head. So the North Star, or whatever the pole star was back then, is fixed. It's precisely at your zenith. It never, ever moves.
So everything else just moves around that one fixed point.
Exactly. The other stars move in perfectly horizontal orbits around you. There's no rising or setting like we see, just this constant, orderly, horizontal rotation.
And that creates a regular, changeless dial plate of the remoter sky.
That's the phrase. It's stable, it's predictable, you can watch it for months on end.
I can see the advantage now. That stability allows for just unprecedented precision and study. If you watch the stars from here, the rotation makes long-term observation really difficult.
Of course.
But if the background stars are moving in a perfect horizontal circle, any deviation becomes instantly obvious.
Instantly. And against that backdrop of perfect stellar regularity, the irregular movements of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, all of them, they couldn't possibly escape observation.
There's strange movements, there are accelerations and retrogrades.
All of it. It would be perfectly marked, measured, and charted. The argument is that the first inhabitants, living in this orderly natural observatory, would be compelled by their environment to become the world's first serious astronomers.
That is a stunning reversal of expectation. The most hostile environment for light becomes the most ideal environment for study.
Yes.
And this must lead directly back to our earlier talks about myth and tradition. This astronomical setup seems to align perfectly with those ancient concepts of time.
It connects absolutely. The source points out that this environment gives us a naturalistic key to traditions of the Eden day.
A year being one day.
Exactly. For polar inhabitants, their world was defined by one macro cycle of light and dark. Their whole concept of time would be geared toward that single massive cycle, not 365 daily rotations.
So when ancient traditions, like those of the Persians, or when Homer mentions a year day, we're not supposed to see that as poetic license.
You're supposed to see it as a literal description of life, based on the primary unit of time experienced by the earliest people. It gives those traditions physical context.
So the astronomy does two things. It supports the location with an advantage for intellectual development, and it explains these seemingly mystical ancient concepts.
A powerful validation for the whole hypothesis.
That's definitely more than a 1-2 punch. It's a fundamental integration of cosmology and culture. Okay, let's transition from the life-giving environment to the event that destroyed it.
The deluge.
The geological confirmation of the deluge and the submergence of Eden.
Right. Section 2 moves into physiographical geology, and the author argues that this field independently supports the occurrence of a vast cataclysm.
And the challenge here is huge. You have to explain not just a flood, but the permanent sinking of an entire continent.
And for that, the source relies heavily on the prevailing 19th century theory of Earth collapse, which stems from secular cooling.
Let's just pause and define this theory clearly, because this is not how modern geology sees the Earth. We know about plate tectonics now.
Of course.
But in the context of the source material, what was this Earth collapsion theory?
It was a very widely held model. It suggested the Earth operates like a rapidly cooling piece of fruit. As the planet cooled over millennia, the inner core, the nucleus, contracted significantly.
Okay.
But a solid, relatively thin crust had already formed on the outside. So the crucial problem was that this contracting interior was constantly withdrawing the foundational support on which the crust rested.
So the crust becomes unsupported, like you said, the shell of a cooling egg with a shrinking yolk inside.
That's the perfect analogy. And the subterranean voids that would result would eventually become too great for the crust's inherent strength. When it finally gives way, the source describes it falling in with the force of incomputable tons.
And that collapse, happening over a massive area, would cause the oceans to rush in, instantly submerging huge tracts of land.
It's a true catastrophe, far more violent than what we typically think of with myths about localized floods.
The source describes it as leaving the globe a wreck.
A wreck. The analogy used is a ruined cathedral whose dome has suddenly fallen in. The rocky strata are left broken, dislocated at all angles. Just total confusion. For the geologists of the time, this theory provided a compelling explanation for the fractured rocks they saw in mountain ranges.
So the argument is that this catastrophic planetary scale collapse is a periodic natural phenomenon, and one of these events just happened to coincide with the existence of early humanity.
Precisely. The author really emphasizes that the accumulating physical evidence compelled certain geologists to believe one of these destructive global events has occurred since the human race was created.
And what's important here is that this belief, in the author's view, stemmed from observed physical facts, the fractured rocks, the sudden changes in strata. It was independent of any religious or biblical record.
That's a critical pushback against pure skepticism.
Yeah.
The author's basically saying, even if you totally dismiss the retarding influence of Jewish legends, the hard geological facts mandate a post-human catastrophic event on a global scale. It's a geological necessity, not a scriptural one.
And the consequence of this particular cataclysm was the permanent destruction of the polar continent.
And the necessary permanent transfer of humanity to lower latitudes.
So how does the geology of the Arctic today support this idea of a submerged continent? Why not just sea ice or a scattered archipelago?
Well, the author directs our attention to the known islands of the Arctic Ocean, specifically mentioning Novaya Zemlya and Spitsbergen. And these islands are not seen as just, a random archipelago that slowly broke apart. They're concluded to be simply the mountaintops that still remain above the surface of the ocean that covered the primeval continent to which they once belonged.
So what we see today as these small, isolated landmasses are really just the highest peaks of a vast submerged system of plains and valleys, the ruins of Eden itself.
Yes. The catastrophe didn't just create a big lake, it sank an entire continental landmass, precisely at the pole. This geological mechanism, the Earth collapsion, is the necessary physical explanation for how the cradle of humanity could disappear so completely.
Leaving only these high mountain peaks as silent witnesses.
Exactly, and that completes the geological confirmation.
It's fascinating. So we've established the beginning through cosmology and the end through geology. Now we have to bridge them. The life that flourished in that paradise.
The biological confirmations.
Which have to confirm that the pole was indeed a center of unparalleled life.
Exactly. The fourth claim deals with prehistoric polar climate. And the scientific findings, even in the 19th century, overwhelmingly confirmed that the climate at the Arctic pole at the time of man's advent
Probably the Miocene or late Tertiary period.
was precisely what the poetic legends of Eden would require.
But what evidence did they have to prove the North Pole was temperate or even subtropical? That still feels like the biggest leap of faith.
The evidence came mainly from paleontology, from fossil remains, which we'll get into, but the conclusion was firm. This climate supported a flora and fauna of almost unimagined vigor and luxuriance.
This wasn't a slow-growth ecosystem.
Not at all. It was rich, abundant, capable of sustaining a large, thriving, and powerful original population. It justifies the description of paradise.
Okay, that sets the stage for the fifth claim, paleontological botany. This has to show that the Arctic wasn't just capable of sustaining life.
But that it was the source, the seed plot of the Earth.
And this is arguably the strongest piece of evidence the author presents.
I think so. The argument is that this polar locality was the cradle of floral life forms for the whole known Earth. And this idea, this polocentric conception, was a major scientific theory at the time.
This wasn't fringe science. It was supported by major figures.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about pioneers like Professor Asa Gray, who was considered the greatest American botanist of his era, Professor Oswald Heer of Switzerland, a leading authority on fossil flora, Sir Joseph Hooker in England.
So the giants of the field.
Their combined work established that the oldest, most foundational floral types were discovered first in Arctic sediments.
What kind of specific plant evidence did they pull out of those strata to make such a radical claim?
Well, the source cites the study of Miocene remains, and studies of these fossil beds in places like Britain and Greenland revealed an abundance of conifers and hardwoods far beyond what their modern climates could ever support.
Give us a specific example that really drives home that climate difference.
They found evidence of a gigantic pine, the Sequoia kootsay, which is closely allied to the modern giant California sequoias.
Wow.
Think about that. A colossal tree needing massive resources, a temperate climate, continuous sunshine, and it flourished near the pole. This doesn't just suggest warmth, it suggests an ecosystem of immense vitality.
And it wasn't just sequoias.
No. You also find maples, oaks, willows, poplars, even grapevines, all found in high Arctic strata.
Okay, so if the Arctic was the origin point, we should see an asymmetrical flow of life, right? Migrating out from the north, but not much flowing the other way.
And the evidence supports this. This is where the work of Sir Joseph Hooker is key. He noted that vast numbers of European and northern plants reached Australia and the southern hemisphere, various land bridges or stepping stones. But conversely, virtually no typical southern vegetation entered the north temperate zone.
That pattern asymmetry, that's the signature of a single source point.
Exactly. If the South were the center of creation, we would expect southern plants to radiate north in abundance. The fact that the migration flowed overwhelmingly southward indicates that the Miocene Arctic continent was the true cradle of all floral types.
The foundational seed plot that dispersed life across the world.
That's the argument.
Okay, let's move from the plants to the animals. Paleontological zoology, the sixth claim. If the flora radiated from the north.
The fauna, including early man, must have followed suit. The author confidently asserts that this Arctic center also originated and radiated the fauna of the prehistoric world.
But this section also introduces that controversial traditional belief, the one that connects right back to Edenic concepts.
The issue of gigantism.
The idea that the first inhabitants were superior, stronger, taller, with greater longevity than any generation since.
Yes. Ancient traditions universally point to the first men having a stature and strength and longevity never attained since the deluge. And while many contemporary critics would just dismiss this as myth,
Right, as pure imagination.
the author argues that modern paleontology confirms gigantism was absolutely a feature of the non-human life of that period.
It's a classic analogy argument. If the conditions were optimal enough to produce giant animals, why not giant humans? What was the animal evidence for this?
We hear of colossal creatures that dominated the landscape. Think of the gigantic Macrotherium giganteum or the enormous Atlantosaurus. The mammals of the Miocene were numerous and, crucially, often of enormous size.
So gigantism was the norm, not the exception, in the Miocene era when this polar Eden supposedly thrived.
That's the point. The energy and vitality of that ecosystem fueled incredible growth. And even if you reject the literal 7-foot human giants of myth, you can't ignore the physical evidence found in early human ancestors.
What evidence did they cite for early human or proto-human strength?
They point to examinations of very ancient human skeletons, like the famous Neanderthal man. And even skeptics had to concede that these skeletons belonged to very strong and muscular men.
And you can see that on the bones themselves.
Yes, the telltale signs are the strong development of the ridges and crests on the bones, which are the insertion points for muscles. Highly developed ridges indicate immense muscular power, far exceeding that of modern humans.
So the skeletal architecture confirms extraordinary strength, even if not necessarily immense stature. The conditions of Eden fostered a highly vigorous species.
Precisely. The synthesis is unavoidable. If the Miocene Arctic continent was demonstrably the cradle of all floral types and all major faunal forms, with their associated gigantism and vigor,
then logically it must also have been the cradle of man.
man is simply the last and most complex piece of that thriving polar ecosystem.
So now we had the location, the life, and the destruction. The final piece of the biological puzzle is the mechanism of dispersion. How did all this life get out?
Right. How did it migrate southward after the catastrophe and the onset of the cold? This involves a fascinating piece of physical geography.
This explains the shape of the continents, right?
The hypothesis explains the southwestern trend of eastern continental coasts as the result of migration patterns driven by temperature-dependent currents.
That's a massive scale of observation, linking global geography to the movement of life. How do the physics work?
The principle is simple. Cold water is denser and heavier than warm water. So following the cataclysm and the subsequent cooling of the Arctic, massive amounts of colder, heavier ocean and air currents began sweeping relentlessly southward from the pole.
And how does that massive cold current flow shape continents and migration?
As these heavy currents moved south, the Earth's rotation, the Coriolis effect, imparts a westward push. This means the currents would press to the westward every obstacle met with in its course, forcing all movable things, from sediment to migrating animals, toward a southwesterly course.
So the currents act like a giant planetary bulldozer, pushing everything movable away from the pole and sweeping it southwest.
And the physical evidence is supposedly visible today in the Earth's geography. If you look at the eastern coasts of the continents, North America, South America, Asia, they exhibit a strange coincidence of a predominantly southwestern trend. They're typically full of bays, inlets, and shoal water.
Which the author suggests is evidence that the ocean floor material was constantly being swept up against them by this flow.
Exactly. Conversely, the western coasts, facing away from the push, should be steeper and straighter.
Which they tend to be.
That's right. The western coasts tend to be more abrupt, suggesting material was constantly being eroded and rolled into the sea by the pressure of the westward pushing currents. This whole pattern is cited as physical proof of a massive long-term southward and westward movement originating from the North Pole.
This suggests the migration of life wasn't just a casual dispersal. It was a desperate, forced retreat.
It was survival. It implies that the arboreal predecessor of man, the pioneer ranks of this movement, was possibly driven naked by the ever-following merciless cold in a southern movement long before the major ice ages.
The migration wasn't a choice. It was a necessary retreat from deteriorating Arctic conditions. The cooling Earth dictated the course of human history.
It had to.
We've now covered 6 massive scientific claims across 3 separate disciplines: cosmology, geology, and biology. Let's move to the ultimate synthesis, the final claim that brings all this disparate data together.
Right. The power of the argument really relies on the cumulative force of all this evidence. The author takes great pride in the fact that 7 distinct, often disconnected fields of inquiry all point to the exact same conclusion.
The circumpolar location.
The circumpolar location.
Let's just reiterate those 7 converging paths just to appreciate the scale of this claim.
Okay. We start with scientific cosmology, which defines where life must begin due to cooling. Then astronomical geography, which identifies the pole as that natural observatory.
Right.
Physiographical geology explains how the continent disappeared. Prehistoric climatology proves the historical warmth. Then paleontological botany establishes the north as the seed plot.
Then the animals.
Paleontological zoology confirms the origin of fauna and the vigor of early life. And finally, paleontological anthropology uses all of that data to explain the migration and unity of the human race.
You know, if you started with the hypothesis that a single origin point must exist, but you didn't know where it was, and you asked 7 different scientists in these fields to find the most probable point based just on their own data, it seems incredibly unlikely they would all land on the most remote and supposedly hostile location on Earth.
That is the rhetorical weight the source material leans on. The convergence itself is presented as proof. It's difficult to argue that such disparate fields, relying on physical, chemical, and biological laws, would all just coincidentally endorse a hypothesis that started in myth.
And this is bolstered by what the author calls the independent discovery confirmation.
Yes.
What's the significance of 2 or more researchers reaching the same conclusion separately?
Well, it's the gold standard of scientific confirmation. It's noted as a surprising fact that 2 independent streams of thought, represented by the author, Warren, and others like Spiller and Winchell, reached this exact same conclusion about the polar location simultaneously.
Why does that matter so much?
Because if the hypothesis were just a clever exercise in cherry-picking data to fit a narrative, then independent researchers following different lines of evidence, one on geology, another on tradition, a third on botany, they should all arrive at different wrong conclusions.
But they didn't.
The fact that 2 or more distinct paths led to the North Pole suggests the conclusion isn't arbitrary, but that it's a necessary deduction driven by the physical facts of the Earth.
That independent verification adds significant weight. It suggests the conclusion is robust, not just persuasive rhetoric.
The text highlights this as not being without significance. It moves the discussion from potential bias to apparent objective truth.
Finally, let's consider the lasting philosophical impact of this. What does establishing a single remote origin point for humanity imply for broader anthropology?
It provides a strong foundation for the claim of the unity of man's origin. For centuries, you had competing ideas. Did humanity arise in multiple places, polygenism, or do we all trace back to one single point, monogenism?
And if that single point is confirmed to be the North Pole, what does that solve?
It solves two huge problems at once. First, it asserts that all of humanity shares one deep origin, making our diversity a result of later migration and adaptation.
Okay.
Second, this single point of departure at the pole, happening before major geological shifts, provides a powerful explanation for why we lack the evolutionary immediate predecessors of man elsewhere on the globe.
Ah, because the evolutionary cradle was destroyed and then evacuated?
Exactly. When the catastrophe hit and the cold began its relentless southward push, the entire population was driven south. The immediate precursor to man was either left behind in the submerging lands or forced into a rapid evolutionary path by the brutal climate change,
So the model requires this massive coordinated southern movement.
which accounts for the subsequent migration and diversification of the human race across the globe.
So, to synthesize this entire scientifically rigorous section, the author takes this radical claim of a North Pole Eden, which seemed purely mythological, and argues that it's the only geographical location confirmed by the initial cooling of the Earth, the unique astronomical conditions, the geological history of cataclysms, and the paleontological evidence of life's origin and forced migration.
It's an attempt to successfully integrate ancient tradition with 19th century science to produce a cohesive, if highly speculative, theory of our origin. The North Pole, the most unlikely place, is revealed by this synthesis to be the scientifically confirmed cradle.
And this successful testing and confirmation of the hypothesis concludes the main exploratory phase of our journey. The author has established his North Pole location through historical accounts, mythological consistency, and now he claims independent scientific verification.
The location is set. The history is written, so to speak.
And here is where it gets really interesting, because now that the location has been theoretically and scientifically confirmed, we have to turn our attention to the consequences of this discovery. If we accept a lost polar Eden, what does that change about how we understand the world?
Well, the implications are massive. They affect everything from biology and terrestrial physics to the interpretation of the most ancient literature and the origin of religion. The final section of the source material explores how this new paradigm requires a complete rewriting of man's history.
Next time, we will be moving into that final part of the book, analyzing the overarching significance and lasting impact of these results. Join us then as we explore the world reshaped by a polar paradise and ask the final provocative question. If our history began in perfection and ended in catastrophe, how much of our modern striving is simply the memory of a lost polar past?
Continuing with the analysis, we will now discuss. Fifth part, further verifications of the hypothesis based on a study of the peculiarities of a polar paradise.
Right, and this is a really critical pivot point in the whole investigation.
It feels like it. We're moving past just myth, aren't we?
Exactly. I mean, up until now, we've been building this case based on, mythological commonalities, the idea that all these cultures remember a lost paradise in the north.
But myth can be subjective.
It can be. So this section is all about trying to prove that hypothesis with objective facts. We're looking for real geographical and scientific details about the North Pole that just happen to perfectly match those ancient stories.
So we're shifting from the story of Eden to the actual, maybe, geometry of Eden.
That's a great way to put it.
We're looking for those specific, unique conditions at the pole that were so powerful, they basically forced the earliest people to create these universal myths.
Yes, we're looking for evidence written not in books, but in the sky, in the water, and even in the fossil record.
Okay, so where do we begin?
Well, the first and maybe most fundamental piece of evidence comes from astronomy. We start with the timing, what the book calls the Eden Day, and how that really bizarre light cycle at the pole shaped the world's first concept of time.
When you say light cycle, you mean the most extreme solar experience you can have on Earth.
Absolutely. The pole experience is a single day that lasts for, well, about an entire year.
6 months of continuous daylight and then 6 months of continuous night.
Exactly. That That dichotomy is so profound, it just had to be the central organizing principle for any civilization that started there. How could that not become the defining feature of their golden age?
You know, it's funny. I have a hard time wrapping my head around a 6-month night and still calling that place paradise.
That's a great question.
I mean, if the Golden Age is remembered as this time of, great bounty and ease, how does perpetual darkness fit into that memory?
Well, it requires us to shift our perspective a little. The memory wasn't necessarily of a perfect, temperate climate.
Right.
That's more of a tropical paradise idea. The memory was of a time when the fundamental rhythms of life were completely different. The sheer length of the day and night was remembered as the primordial cycle. And the sources show this is surprisingly widespread.
Okay, so who is remembering this single annual cycle?
We see it in the ancient traditions of the Northmen, the Persians, the East Aryans. They all seem to preserve this knowledge of a single sunrise and a single sunset per year.
And it goes beyond them, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. Homer, in his poetry, has passages that many scholars think are referencing this year-day concept. And even traditions that are really far removed, like the Navajos, they speak of a time when the cycle of light and dark was just vastly different.
That implies an incredibly long memory, spanning maybe thousands of years and huge distances, all pointing back to that one unique astronomical signature.
Precisely.
Okay, but let's move from the timing to the structure of the sky, the Eden zenith, because how the heavens look is just as important as how the sun moves.
This is where the pole becomes, well, the world's first natural observatory. Think about it. You're standing on the geographic North Pole. You look up.
And the pole star, the one fixed point, is directly overhead.
Yeah.
Like your zenith.
Exactly. It's not off to the side. It's right there.
So the rotational axis of the entire planet is perfectly aligned with the rotational axis of the sky from your perspective as the observer.
That is the key insight. And the result is just total celestial order. All the other stars, they don't rise and set. They just move in these perfectly horizontal, circular orbits around you.
No wobble, no complex arc across the sky.
None. It's perfect, fixed, unchanging celestial clockwork. Any people living there wouldn't just become astronomers. They would almost be forced to understand the cosmos just by looking up.
And that sense of fixed eternal order must have directly informed their religious ideas.
How could it not?
If the heavens are perfect, then the home of the gods must be right there at that point of perfection.
Absolutely. That perfect motion naturally defined the most sacred place in the universe. If everything revolves around a single fixed point directly above your head, that point becomes the axis of the cosmos, the absolute center, the true heaven.
And the really wild thing is how many cultures shared this idea.
It's astounding. We're talking about Hebrew, Egyptian, Akkadian, Greek, Vedic, Chinese, Germanic, even Japanese traditions. They all place their highest celestial seat, their cosmic summit, at the pole.
So it's not just one or two cultures, it's a global consensus on the geography of heaven.
Right.
Which suggests it wasn't some, philosophical idea they all came up with independently. It sounds like a description of an actual remembered observation from one very specific place.
It connects their highest religious ideas to a verifiable geographical reality, the only place on Earth where the stars behave that way.
Okay, so that covers the sky, the perfect fixed polar observatory. Now, what about the water? We have to talk about one of the biggest puzzles in ancient literature, the four-way river in Genesis.
Yes, the quadrifurcate river. The four rivers that flow out of Eden, Pison, Gihon, Hiddekel, and Euphrates.
For centuries, people try to find this on a map, right? Usually somewhere in Mesopotamia.
And they always failed. Because, you just can't find a single source on a modern map that gives rise to four major rivers flowing out to the four quarters of the world. It doesn't exist.
So most scholars just threw up their hands and said it must be symbolic, purely mythic.
But the polar hypothesis offers this simple and kind of elegant solution that lines up the text with a possible physical reality.
How so?
If you imagine the North Pole before the deluge was the summit of the Earth, a high continental landmass, then suddenly the Genesis description makes perfect sense.
Here's this continental watershed.
Exactly. The single river system starts high up on these polar heights. A single source splits on that high ground and then flows outward in four great streams toward the four cardinal points, eventually hitting the oceans.
So it's a global watershed starting at the highest point, not a local river system in the Middle East.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this model finds an incredible parallel in Hindu cosmology, which tells you this wasn't just a Near Eastern idea.
Right, Mount Meru.
Mount Meru, the cosmic column. In Hindu thought, that's where mankind begins. And on that summit, the single river Ganga comes down and immediately divides into four main streams.
Let me guess. Flowing to the four corners of the world.
To the four quarters of the world, the Sita, Chakshu, Bhadra, and Alakananda.
That is a staggering parallel. You have the Abrahamic and the Vedic traditions, thousands of miles and years apart, both describing the cradle of life as a central cosmic mountain where one river splits into four. The structure is just too similar to be a coincidence.
It's like a geographical fingerprint left behind by a common, now submerged homeland.
So we have the ordered sky and the centrally divided water. Let's move to the land itself and maybe the most powerful symbol of paradise of all, the world tree.
The central tree. It's a universal archetype. You find it everywhere.
In Norse mythology, it's Yggdrasil.
Right. And you see it in Akkadian and Persian thought, in Chinese Taoism with the Tong tree on Quinlan. They all have this magnificent sacred tree at the absolute center of the world.
So how does the North Pole explain this specific symbol?
The central tree is always shown as the heaven pillar. It's the physical version of the axis of heaven and earth, marking the exact polar center. It's the earthly equivalent to the pole star overhead.
Ah, okay, so it grounds the astronomy. If the sky is rotating around an invisible axis, it's natural to imagine a physical pillar, a giant tree holding it all up.
Correct. The scholar Massey pointed out that even the concept of nirvana, the realm of absolute rest, was first conceived at the polar center of the revolving stars. The tree, the pillar, the axis, they all represent that fixed, calm center of a perfectly organized universe.
Okay, now let's talk biology. Because paradise is always described as a place with this extraordinary exuberance of life, what the ancients called the Golden Age.
Yes, and they also talked about the people. The sources describe a time when the first humans had this colossal stature and incredible longevity.
A huge contrast to the weak and puny men who came after the flood.
Exactly. You read Hesiod, Ovid, Plato's Critias. They all paint this picture of extraordinary vigor. They describe the cradle of the race as having life on a scale we just can't imagine.
And this sounds like poetic exaggeration until you connect it to the paleontology of the Arctic.
Yes, because paleontology confirms that the Arctic continent during the Miocene epoch, the relevant time period, was the biological seed plot of the entire Earth. It was a place of unimaginable luxuriance.
So the scientific evidence actually backs up the myth of a golden race of extraordinary strength and size.
It directly supports it.
Can you give us some examples? Because this is what's now the frigid Arctic Circle.
We're talking about finding fossils of tropical and semi-tropical life that just defy our modern idea of the high latitudes. For example, immense conifers, like the Sequoia coutiae.
Wait, a type of sequoia, like the giant redwoods in California.
A very close relative, yes. Imagine finding fossils of trees on that colossal scale in what we now think of as tundra and ice caps.
That is startling physical evidence. That means the climate was radically different.
It was. And it wasn't just the plants. The fossil record gives us these enormous creatures. We find the remains of colossal tortoises, gigantic mammals.
Like what?
Maybe the best example is the Ancylitherium pentelici. This was a beast sort of like a rhinoceros, but significantly larger than any rhino alive today.
Wow.
So you have these huge, vigorous life forms, the plants and the animals. And they provide the objective, scientific correlation to the mythological golden race of giants.
This is really the ultimate verification, then. It ties the memory of gigantic life from the myths to the hard scientific fact of gigantic life existing in the Arctic before it all changed.
The three pillars of evidence, astronomy, hydrology, and biology, they all converge on this single, unique polar location.
The consistency is what's so powerful.
That's the main takeaway, I think. The fixed stars, the need for a central watershed to explain the four rivers, and the physical evidence of gigantism in the Arctic fossils. None of these things are easily dismissed as just random mythology.
They function as a kind of precise geographical key.
Exactly. A key that unlocks why all these different world myths share such specific and, frankly, weird markers.
It turns the myths from just poetry into a kind of historical data, remembered in the stars and in the rocks. Well, that concludes our deep dive into the further verifications of the polar hypothesis.
Next, we'll move on to the final part of the book, which addresses the broader significance of these astounding results for fields like biology, physics, and ancient literature, especially concerning lost antediluvian knowledge.
And for you to consider until our next deep dive. If the Earth itself provided the first natural observatory at the North Pole, what sophisticated systematic science might the earliest humans have possessed before the deluge scattered their people and reduced that complex knowledge to what their later descendants dismissed as mere barbarian folklore?